my read on state politics over the last several years is that we are witnessing a fundamental shift in the political alliances of the two major parties, particularly in the largest, most powerful party, which of course is the Democratic Party here in the state. And those tectonic plates have always been held together in the Democratic Party between what I call the wine and cheese Democrats, right? Essentially the higher household income, tend to be higher educated, tend to live in the suburbs and the coasts, tend to have interests more aligned with on issues of the environment and what might be called issues in social justice, tend to have their kids in private schools. The other side of the party, as I see it, I describe as the beer and pretzel Democrats. These are the ones that tend to be lower to lower middle class, tend to be much more ethnically diverse, tend to require a better performance of public institutions, whether they be public schools or public safety. I've been witnessing over the last few years has been a growing fracturing of that. And in so doing, the wine and cheese Democrats have essentially gotten the upper hand on many of the policy issues, or they have benefited from many of the policy issues that you've just laid out. So whether we're talking about the high cost of housing, they tend to be homeowners and are perfectly fine with their household values growing. When it comes to education, they tend to not be as deeply invested in that because their kids tend to go to private schools. When it comes to issues of crime and criminal justice, they tend to live in areas that are safer. And so the interests that had generally kept together the Democratic Party in the state, I've sensed a widening gap.
What do you think is the biggest sort of fault line right now in this sort of diversion between the sort of the wine and cheese, or classically called the limousine liberals, and the traditional working class kinds of Democrats? Is it the I would suspect maybe the defund the police kind of movement, right? These people are completely isolated from the consequences of high crime, and so they can virtue signal and pat themselves on the back when they talk about police brutality and all that, and not have to worry that the police will show up to their own neighborhoods, which largely entrenched and have security guards, and if they live in a gated community. Would it be? I'm instantly reminded. So you work at a university. When I was in college, I remember having this discussion with someone about. There's actually a girl I was dating, and she said she didn't believe in monogamy. And I've actually heard this sentiment echoed a few times. And then when you ask them personally, what do you want for yourself? They're like, oh, I want to get married and have kids and, have the honeymoon in the Mediterranean and, have the nice big wedding, right? But for everyone else, for the lower classes, yeah, monogamy's outdated. Just for me, it's necessary, right? So you kind of have this like a cognitive dissonance. They want to still get sort of the benefits of certain aspects of society, but are okay with denying them to other groups, so long as it makes them look somehow more virtuous. Like, what are those? Are there any other fault lines you kind of see in that division?
So you raised a very good, a couple important data points at the beginning, Ashton, which was the migration patterns of Californians. And I think that is a place that we can at least start to understand some of the real important issues, because people are voting with their feet here in California, that we can do as free, liberty-loving Americans. If we don't like something, we can leave it. And there was a really interesting study done by the Legislative Analyst's Office, the LAO, which is the nonpartisan, essentially policy research arm of the state legislature, looking at who migrated in and out of California between 2007 and 2017. So essentially a 10-year window. And when they analyzed who was coming and leaving, to your point, first, more people were leaving than coming. So, let's at least start with that. But then when we explore who was leaving, some fascinating things come out of that. Number one, the younger the age demographic, the more likely you were to be leaving. So your point about the millennials leaving and then Gen Z certainly was part of it. The number one household or age demographic leaving the state was actually Californians under the age of 18. Now, that didn't dictate that we had a runaway problem. These were kids in families that, because they were multiple kids under the age of 18, it was the families who were leaving the state. When we look at household income, the further down the household income scale that you went, the more likely it was that you were going to leave the state. But here's the thing that I think, has to be alarming, especially for those who value the great diversity of the state of California. When we looked at the demographics of the people leaving, it tended to be people who were those who were ethnically diverse. Our brown and black Californians tend to be the ones who were leaving, while older whites were coming into the state. Again, looking at this 10-year window, and I don't think there's any reason to doubt that those trend lines have continued. And so essentially, California has always seen itself as a diverse, middle-class friendly, family-friendly paradise. But when you look at the actual data, all of those data points conflict with that vision that I think many Californians have. And so the question is really going to come to California voters. Do we deal with the reality of what California has become, which is essentially and again, these were the good data points that you pulled out, ones in which there is significant and growing income inequality, one in which we have such high poverty rates, one in which people who are our future as a state, are leaving the state. And certainly families are finding it more and more difficult to live here because of the cost of living. Do we come to that realization, and then do we take the next step to begin to respond to, overturn, change the very real public policies that have created an environment that is causing people to leave the state?
Yeah, it's just so interesting, right? Because the very people who incessantly lecture about diversity and income inequality are enacting policies which lead to the erosion of diversity and exacerbating income inequality, right? And the states that they demonize, like Texas or Florida or it used to be Arizona, though not so much anymore because it's more of a purple state now. But they are kind of the states that many of these diverse people and people who are in the working class, lower middle class, are moving to. So it's hilarious. I mean, it's sad, but it's so interesting. Obviously, it must be economics being one of the main drivers. Would you say it's housing as the number one economic issue, or would you say it's wages or something of that nature?
Yeah, I think the two are really intertwined. I think first and foremost, and this again goes back to this LAO study when they were asking questions about what were some of the reasons. Cost of housing was a significant driver in the broader topic of cost of living here in the state versus other states.
Right.
But there are others, and you mentioned before energy costs, from the cost of a gallon of gasoline to what it costs to cool or heat our homes, is just so much significantly higher here than even neighboring states. These are issues as well. But I would also put in there too, the political scientist Walter Russell Mead had this phrase he used to describe essentially democratically run states and Republican run states, and he called it the red state model and the blue state model. The red state model was essentially, you're going to get lower taxes, but you're not going to get the quality of services that you would otherwise. And that's the trade-off that you're going to make as somebody living in that state. The blue state model was, you're going to pay a lot in taxes, but you're going to get great roads and great schools and all great police departments and all the public services that you should expect. Well, we are at the inverse of the blue state model. We are in a place where we are paying extremely high taxes and fees, both at the gas pump and on our income tax forms. But we are not nearly seeing the performance of government, whether it's in our local schools or our roads or public safety, that one would expect. And again, I think that needs to be brought into this conversation around cost of living, which is the broader regulatory state and taxes, which again continue to contribute to the cost of living, and we don't see the payoff. It would be one thing if our schools were top 10, every street had just been paved over, we had crime rates dropping through the floor. The Democrats would have a viable case to make, but we're just not seeing that.
Worst of both worlds. You're paying higher for worse services.